the Global Food Regulatory Science Society. GFOR's mission includes knowledge generation and dissemination, underpinning food regulatory decisions, in support of food control systems, Our interventions focus on promoting food regulatory scientific disciplines, consistent reliance on food regulatory sciences enables robust food control programs, contributing to more resilient food systems and a safe, accessible, abundant and nutritious food supply.
ربع
Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the ultra-processed food, defining processed and ultra-processed foods, outcomes of the IFO's Task Force on Ultra-Processed Foods. My name is Dr. Ruba Gusus. I'm currently working as a food safety expert at the Jordan Food and Drug Administration, JFDA, and a member of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, GFORS. I'm pleased to be your moderator today for this 7th webinar organized by GFORS as part of its Food Regulatory Science webinar series, and to have participants from all around the world. Before I introduce our speakers and the topic, please note that Arabic interpretation is available for this webinar. Additionally, we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation via the chat box. We will have a dedicated question and answer segment following Dr. Windhup's talk to address your questions. As many of you know, the NOVA food classification system, though widely used, lacks clarity and quantitative criteria, leading to possible confusion about how ultra-processed foods may be defined. The International Union of Food Science and Technology, IFOST, Task Force on Food Processing for Nutrition, Diet and Health, was tasked to address such ambiguities and to improve the focus of food classification, distinguishing the respective impact of processing and of formulation. The task force is offering the IFOS formulation and processing classification scheme, IF and PC, to refine the NOVA approach. The IF and PC scheme introduces a 6-step approach that differentiates between formulation and processing, quantifies their effect using metrics like the nutrient-rich food index, and consolidates this into a unified classification system. This methodology provides a clearer quantifiable framework for categorizing processed foods, enhancing research, reproducibility, and evidence-based recommendations. This webinar will present the scheme and shed light on the task force suggestions to expand this framework to include other essential food properties such as safety, sustainability, and affordability, using a similar classification process. This work calls for interdisciplinary collaboration to refine and validate the system, ensuring its possible benefits to consumers globally by enabling more informed food choices. We are honored to have the opportunity to hear introductory remarks from Professor Lilia Arine, who is a professor in dairy process technology at University Copenhagen, Denmark, and is the IOFOS Scientific Council Chair, and also from Professor Samuel Godefroy, President of IOFOST. Professor Lilia and Professor Samuel, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Lilia Arni, and I'm sharing the scientific committee of IOFOS. And for the ones that are not familiar, the International Union of Food Science and Technology is a country membership organization, and is the voice of the food science and technology. And in this context, IOFOS aims to strengthen food science and technology's role in helping and secure the world's food supply and eliminate hunger by delivering programs such as the distance assisting training, workshops, and promoting relevant activities. And this is based in these goals that IOFOS, through consultation of international and well-known experts from the global communities of nutritionists, food scientists, and food process engineers, have established an international task force on food processing for nutrition, diet, and health. And this has been done to address and clarify the role of food processing and the terms used, such ultra-processed foods, in several classification systems. More specifically, we target the NOVA classification, where food processing has been built in to define and use a concept of ultra-processed foods that has created a large number of controversies, and therefore the use of food processing systems, food processing in classification systems should be reviewed. So in this, to tackle this problem, IOFOS has recognize that maybe there is a need for classifications to support dietary guidelines and policies, as well public-related decisions, but they should be based on scientific facts and data to support these objective decisions across the involved sectors. So this IOFOS task force on food processing for nutrition, diet, and health has been assisted by a number of international experts that have been nominated to be part of an expert advisory group, and the results of this work will be presented today at this workshop by Professor Eric Wintav. So thank you for attending this event, and I hope that the information provided to you help you to clarify some of these controversies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and good morning to you wherever you are. Good afternoon, good evening to you from the People's Republic of China, in Beijing, more precisely, where I have the privilege to be at the end of another event organized by IOFOS on functional foods. It is my privilege and honor to be with you today, and thank you, Dr. Ruba, for the kind introduction. It's great that we kick off together a series of dissemination events that are dedicated to sharing the outputs of the work that has been underway under the leadership and the auspices of the Task Force on Food Processing for Nutrition, Diet, and Health. I'm grateful to Professor Eric Windab for taking the time in his schedule to be with us and actually to kick off this series of dissemination events. As indicated by Lilia and by Ruba in her introduction, this particular theme of food classification, the way the food classification system is used in various applications, whether be it in helping scientific research or in regulatory decision making, as well as in various policy files, including issues related to taxation and positioning of food, has been and will continue to be an important area of discussion for months and even years to come. It was therefore very important for IOFAST to be being an important voice of the global food science and technology community to be able to contribute with facts, with scientific analysis, and with providing its input in what exists in the area of food classification, and particularly in helping to identify the various parameters, whether be it processing, whether be it formulation, in the way foods are positioned in the web of classifications. Again, very thankful for the work that the task force on food processing for nutrition, diet, and health. This work has been underway for a number of months. We are now reaching the point where we are hoping to reap the benefit of the analysis that was conducted by a number of scientists for many months, and grateful to the level of collaboration that is happening between IOFAST and one of its disciplinary groups dedicated to food regulatory science, namely the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, to kick off these dissemination events. So today's event is meant to be an initial webinar where we are going to be hearing from Professor Windab about the outputs of the work underway. We are expecting during the upcoming period a number of events that IOFAST will be spearheading in collaboration with its adhering bodies in Europe in January, in collaboration with the African Union, the Union of African Universities, also in January. And we are hoping also to organize a number of events that are geographically targeted, so essentially addressing the needs of the food science and technology community in various parts of the world. Without further ado, I would like to once again thank Professor Windab for his leadership on this file, and also address my thanks to all members of the task force for their contribution, and looking forward to the presentation of Professor Windab and the discussion that will follow. Back to you, Ruba. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And really, this is a great work done, and we really appreciate your presence with us, our professors. And we are also honored to have our main speaker for the session, a distinguished expert, Professor Eric Windab, a professor who represents the Institute of Food, Nutrition and Health at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich, Switzerland, and also is the chair and corresponding author of the IOFAST Task Force on Food Processing for Nutrition, Diet and Health. Again, I thank you all for joining us today. Professor Eric, I'm really privileged to be moderating a webinar where you are the presenter, and you will I'll hand it over to Professor Eric. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thanks very much, Ruba, for this kind introduction, and welcome everybody for this webinar and for this presentation. I feel honored to give you the results from 2 years of work of the task force on processing for nutrition, diet, and health. And we'll share my screen for the presentation now with you. which should work now. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we do. It's
Perfect.
working.
Okay, as you can see, so we had, besides myself, Lilia Arne, whom you just met before, Hongda Chen, Jia Henry, Hong Song Kim, and Barbara Schneemann. So a mixed team in the task force from nutritionists who are looking at the nutrition side of the problem, food scientists, food engineers, and we were also supported by an advisory board and worked out what you will hear now as a result. Within the past 2 years, we were founding this group, and this task force was starting to develop it at the IOFOS Congress in Singapore 2 years ago. What I will focus on in this report is first a summary of the NOVA classification analysis, because this was certainly the starting point in order to enter into the field and look for what can be improved in order to avoid ambiguities and problems appearing. We saw the differentiation and quantification of formulation and process is of importance. And from this insight, we derived then the IOFOS formulation and processing classification scheme as a suggestion for modification, for refinement. In particular, we want to offer the NOVA community to think about, let's say, ambiguities and problems which were caused by the NOVA, and are ready to assist in refining according to the lines which I will show you. Summary at the end. So you all know we were all a bit puzzled in the past years about the ultra-processed foods, even though it was already published by Carlos Montero, the NOVA system, in 2009. So it was developing to an extent and being introduced to an extent that at some point the reaction was really necessary in order to avoid further problems, because we see that implementation or the try to implement it has already caused quite some problems in different places. So the NOVA classification, as we have learned, and as we have analyzed on processed food class designations, is naming these classes, as I show you here, non-processed, minimally processed, processed, ultra-processed. And when you read this in the classification, you would certainly assume that there is quite some scale behind, processing intensity increase from the non-processed to the ultra-processed. However, the criteria for belonging to one of these classes, if you read the NOVA classification, or main criteria are addition of sugar, salt, saturated fats, and additives, so-called cosmetic or non-kitchen used additives. Now, if you look at this is clear formulation, or stems from the recipe description, and formulation is not processing. So designing or designating classes according to processing and then having the criteria sorted according to formulation is certainly one of the main ambiguities and confusing problems. So confusing formulation and processing, and in particular also missing the quantification for both of these. Neither the processing degree nor the formulation degree or intensity of both is quantified. The next step we analyzed is because when we look at the NOVA concept, so NOVA has a frame which not only tries to classify the food at the point of purchase, but also builds the bridge from this point of purchase to obesity and health risks. So there is we call it a food impact correlation, which is done. However, as we just heard before, formulation and processing are confused. That means the base for this kind of correlation with obesity and health risk is pretty weak. So we try to bring in, or the task force has worked on trying to bring in clarification which could strengthen these base, and as a consequence then also improve these food impact correlations, as I will show you. Since the food impact correlation is, as you mainly may know, empirical, based on observational studies, so this is non-evidence based, and accordingly, so the weak construct is something which we had to face and to tackle. So as the Third problem we identified, besides formulation and processing, which is not differentiated and not quantified, that there is this weak correlation of food classification with obesity and health risk and CCD risks. Now the question is, how can we do better? So can we make suggestions which allow for solving, tackling these problems? The first step we did was differentiating definitions to be set up for formulation and processing. And we defined, after some discussion, as short as possible, as clear as possible, formulation as systematic selection of relative quantities of ingredients for a food product, and processing as treatment of a food material to achieve a desired effect. It was important in this context to look at what processing is typically used for, or how processing is defined from those people who do the process engineering or who define what processing should do. And this is why I show you this scheme, which has been developed over many years. We call it the S-Pro square scheme. It's the relationship between process and the properties, because we do processing in order to generate, to improve properties of our food. But the detailed understanding, the quantitative understanding, works only versus structure. So we can say process makes structure, and structure encodes the properties. The properties we are interested in is certainly what the consumer prefers, sensory, convenience aspects, what the consumer accepts in terms of safety, affordability, price, sustainability, other socio-political aspects, and what will be the main focus on this topic now in my talk is certainly the needs, the nutrition and the health-related needs. We sometimes put this together to a so-called PAN profile of a consumer, which describes, let's say, these proportions of preference, acceptance, and needs. On the structural side, we have a hierarchic scheme. Our foods are built hierarchically from a micro to a macro scale, from a molecular scale to the macro scale to the piece of food which we put into our mouth. And with each of these length scales, also time scales of structural changes are connected. On the processing side, we know about processing principles and unit operations. So to understand quantitative relationships between process and properties, we should take structure into account, and then we can quantify process structure functions, structure property functions, to get causal relationships between what processing should do, because it is targeted to product property generation by structure modulation. This is how we can summarize this. And the formulation comes into, what we generate as a recipe enters the process, and then the process is depending on what we want to target or which properties we target, then the process is moving along this track via the structural characterization. When we want to classify, so I would like to show you that we have certainly several properties of the food according to which we could classify. We are now focusing on the nutrition value because this is related to what the normal scheme has addressed. But if somebody develops a food, if a company develops a food, so besides nutrition value, there is safety, there is sustainability, palatability, affordability, convenience. There is this, let's say, bunch of properties to be considered. Now we want to focus now on the nutrition value. And whenever we do a classification, it certainly needs some criteria. So first of all, where, at which point of the value chain, you see here an extended food value chain, which starts from the harvest of the raw materials, goes via the production of the food to the digestion steps, the metabolic response, let's say to the end of this extended food value chain, which we may call the point of living of the consumers. And what is necessary is we need classification parameters. So since we want to take processing into account and show the role of processing for the classification at the point of purchase, so we need some characteristics, some classification parameters, which can describe the impact of processing and formulation as shown before. If you want to do this with respect to the nutrition values, so it's certainly the nutrients to be prominently in front, and we will focus on the nutrient concentrations because this is something which we know from nutrition profiling for dietary guideline recommendations. So we can base on this. This is what we decided, that first of all, our target property, the nutrition value, has to be quantified before we can enter into quantification on the impact of processing and formulation on this target property on the nutrition value. So we could certainly also have another choice of where we want to classify, not only at the point of purchase, but this is what we wanted to, or what we selected now in order to directly compare to the NOVA classification, because they do the same. They also focus on the point of purchase for a food. One could think about, as soon as there is more quantitative information, more causal relationships known about digestion steps, metabolic responses, to also do a classification at a later step of these extended food value chain. But before the point of purchase, we have all in hands, we can control it, we can quantify it, and this is why we certainly focus on that part. And the processing anyhow was intended to be prominently expressed in order to describe the role of processing properly and not just verbally, and then have criteria which are not related to processing. Okay, in order to start this quantification of the nutrition value, our target property, so we had the choice between different schemes which were already known, let's say, from some areas on this globe where they are practiced. The Nutri-Score, like in France and some other countries in Europe, Health Star rating in Oceania, Nutrition-Rich Food Index, which started its definition and application in the US. And we decided for the Nutrition-Rich Food Index. I will give you the reasons later. What does that mean? Nutrition-Rich Food Index, to define the nutritional value, works like identifying disqualifying nutrients and qualifying nutrients, like the number of disqualifyings, maybe disqualifying ones, maybe 3, like sodium, added sugar, saturated fatty acids, nutrients which are qualifying, protein, fiber, vitamin A. So the number can vary. We typically saw that 5 to 14 of these are used. So the NRF was used for different numbers also of qualifying nutrients, and in order to try what is the best description scheme. Typically, what has been often used is an NRF 9.3, so 9 qualifying, 3 disqualifying nutrients, as mentioned here. And the definition of these 9, the 3, is the relative masses relative to the recommended daily intake values. So this is in principle a sum of relative dimensionless mass ratios, which gives numbers between -200 and +200. On the minus side, we may have sugared, deeply on the minus side, we may have sugared beverages. On the plus side, we may have fresh lemon juice and similar type of fruit or vegetable juices, for example. I give you here the definitions, not going into further detail, but it's exactly the sums of these ratios as I have just mentioned. And then you can relate it, or you have to decide whether you relate it to a base of, let's say, 100 kilocalories, or you could also use portion sizes of 100 grams defined, or serving sizes. We used the 100 kilocalorie base in order to define the Nutrition-Rich Food Index 9.3 to quantify the nutrition value for our further work. Now, let me come to the process analysis. How can we analyze a process, or how can we quantify what a process is doing with respect to the nutrition value, with respect to our target property? And so what we are using is analysis as typically done in process engineering by balance equations. I give you an example. When you have a processing system, you may do an energy balance or a mass balance. So that means your system is the process, and energy A1 goes in and energy A1 goes out, and the system can consume or generate energy depending. So a delta energy, and the same with the mass, a delta mass is what the system is doing, let's say, respectively. So, and the same thing we do also for another property, not the energy, not the mass, but the nutrition value quantified by the NRF 9.3 as the example given before. So that means we have an input NRF 9.3. This would be all these numbers defined by the NRF definition given before. And if the process is changing the NRF, so we will have an output NRF which is different. So this means that measured ingredients, or when we take the ingredients going into the process and we calculate the NRF 9.3, we have a clear quantitative definition of the formulation. The formulation is the recipe, the ingredients, the sum of the ingredients entering the process. And what comes out is certainly, or in systems or in processing systems where the process is impacting on the NRF. So we have a different NRF 9.3, 2. And the delta between these two, input NRF and output NRF, is certainly a characteristics of this process. This tells you a delta NRF 9.3 would quantitatively tell you how the NRF has been changed by passing the process. And with this, we have a quantification of the impact of the process, which has the same base like the formulation definition of the nutrition value, so which was the NRF. So NRF and delta NRF suit for formulation quantification and process impact quantification. Just one slide with some equations, which are very simple, just repetition. The NRF is typically defined as the recommended nutrients, the number as explained before, the number of recommended nutrients minus the number of nutrients to be limited. So this difference gives us the number for the NRF 9.3. And as just explained, the delta NRF, which is the NRF 9.3, for example, after processing minus the NRF before processing gives us this delta. And with this, the quantification, the quantitative measure of the impact of the process. What we can do, and what I'm suggesting here already, because you will see what that means when we work with it, you can also recouple, let's say, the formulation definition via the NRF and the processing definition, processing impact definition via the delta NRF, because if you have now criteria for the formulation and for the processing separately, you have a two criterion classification, and this looks in the first view more complex than having a single criterion. So just for the future, I'm not saying this is already ready to go for consumer interaction or for labeling. We are far from that. But if we want to go for simplification in the future, so we can recouple these two parameters. The NRF for the formulation and the delta NRF for the processing can be recoupled in a way which is a kind of a linear coupling, as I show you here. So we can see here the NRF 9.3 for the formulation and the delta NRF 9.3 for the processing impact. And we call this, as you see it here, FPFI. So this is a formulation and processing food index. So the superscript N denotes that we are having as the property, the food property, considered the nutrition value. So this would be a coupling, but now of two quantified influencing parameters, the one for the nutrition, the other one for the processing impact, in order to re-simplify into a one parameter scheme. The A and the B, which is shown here, and also these factor 2 here, was chosen in order to show a diagram, which I will show you in the next slide, to, let's say, design such a diagram with which we can properly work with these two parameter system to, let's say, have the complexity to some extent reduced by visualization, by representation with such a diagram. We call it the classification matrix diagram. And this is what I show you here. You see on the x-axis, you see the NRF 9.3 as the parameter to quantify the formulation impact on the nutrition value. And on the y-axis, we have the delta NRF 9.3 for characterizing the impact on processing. We also see values of the FPFI. So the FPFI is just explained as the formulation and processing food index, which we defined from values between -10 and +10. You see the corner values, lower left corner would have a value of -10, upper right corner, a value of +10. Now, how can we work? How can we orient in such a diagram? Let's assume we have a food with a certain formulation, and this allows us to calculate the NRF according to what I showed you before for this point, which I call P1. So you see the P1 is placed on a line which from a delta NRF axis perspective is the 0 line. So no processing yet. We just choose a formulation, we build a recipe, and this defines in this space of this diagram the P1. Now, if the formulation would, let's say, be developed in a different way, adding maybe more ingredients which include nutrients to be limited, then we would certainly worsen the quality of our recipe. So we would move along the red arrow from the P1 to the P2, like adding sugars would make such a move. If we would have, let's say, the opposite, if we had ingredients which have more vitamins or more minerals, we would move from P1 to P3. So that means we would move without processing, just by the formulation, left and right on the 0 processing line. Now let's look what processes are doing, because this was only the formulation. If our formulation, which is existing in P1, would be processed in a way that we have a positive impact on processing on the NRF, because the NRF is our orientation. So we would move up this line from P1 to P4. So a processing impact now delivers not only a change in NRF, but a delta NRF. That means along the y-axis, we also have a motion, and this makes us move into the positive direction of NRF and into the positive direction of delta NRF from P1 to P4. If we had a process like concentrating micronutrients by a concentration step, so it would certainly move by a concentration process from the P1 to P4. If we had the opposite, we would move along this inclined line, 45 degrees inclined line. This is where the factors in the equation for the FPFI I showed you before play a role, but which do not matter for the time being. So whenever we have a process which is reducing, deteriorating, maybe vitamins, like a pasteurization, sterilization process, we would move from the P1 to the P5. If, of course, which had to be accepted by the regulatory aspect. So if you could add something or combine it with some other components which improve, again, from a recipe, from an ingredients perspective, like in food fortification, you could then move from P5 to P6. Yeah. The same could certainly also, just as an example from the P2, we could have a process added, which might improve after having chosen a not so good ingredient composition, which shifted from P1 to P2, but we could maybe improve by some processing which concentrates vitamins or minerals, for example. Okay, so this is the general motion in this diagram. And now you can see when we go for this one parameter thinking, this was the explanation in the 2-parameter thinking space along formulation and processing separately. When we would couple it with this FPFI value, so you see whenever we move along these arrows shown here, we would also change this FPFI value rectangular to the processing motion or the processing movements in this diagram. So you could also read out, let's say, the coupled criterion. What would this mean? This would mean by formulation and processing, we have improved a coupled quantitative value accordingly to what the change in FPFI would mean. We recommend in the first place to go for the 2-parameter system, because as scientists, you can better work with it. You can better define what can be optimized from the formulation and from the processing perspective. It's just the outlook that people who say, okay, you make it more complex, nobody will be able to apply this, that there is an outlook into further resimplification if one's thinking into application for consumers. Okay, I summarize here. Horizontal lines are describing a formulation impact, inclined lines by these 45 degrees, and a processing impact, and the green and red were given for improvements and deteriorations. So let's make it a bit more substantial. This is why I show you examples from foods, and I may start on the right-hand side, just as one of the examples, a raw carrot, which is well placed as a vegetable with a lot of nutrients and micronutrients, which make it high in an NRF value, in the formulation value. Now, if we would cook the carrot, we would move, certainly we would deteriorate to some extent, losing some vitamins, for example, and the cooked carrot would move accordingly to what I explained before, to the lower left along these inclined lines. If we would try to produce a dish of glazed carrots, so we would add some sugar, so then the recipe would already shift from the P1 to the P2, and then cooking in order to get the glazed carrots. So then you would add the processing change from P2 to P3. I give one more example, which is, let's say, a pea protein isolate generation, enriching in protein, while, depends on how you do this, while not losing micronutrients to a larger extent. So you could certainly protein concentration as a desirable ingredient, desirable component, the proteins would certainly then improve the nutrition value, and that means the concentration process of protein isolate production would mean that we improve and move from P2 to P3 according to this positive impact of the process. Okay, what we could do, and this refers now to the FPFI value, when we have this, think about the future for one parameterizing, reparameterizing the system, we could also underlay a color scheme. You know, if people are used to traffic light systems, you could certainly give the FPFI values some color code, and then you could reintroduce traffic light. But now the traffic light system would be based on differentiation of processing and formulation impact, and quantification of these, the degree of processing, the degree of improvement or deterioration of a recipe or what is done by the process would then be behind. Okay, with that said, I wanted to show what for the future may be of additional importance, because we have tackled this in the task force, because in principle, and I show you here again, the NRF definition. So you remember the NRF had this NR term for the nutrients recommended and this limiting term for the nutrients to be limited. So that means a process could only be quantified in its impact on a food if some of the desirable nutrients are enriched, the NR growing, or some of the nutrients to be limited would be diluted or would be deleted or inactivated in the system. However, there is other processing steps or other reasons for processing which could be included. And this is why I come back to now for reasoning why the NRF was chosen. The NRF, the nutrient-rich food index, is very flexible in also adding other terms. And I give you an example, because what is relevant for the nutrition value of a food may be anti-nutrients. So I'm just making an example of an anti-nutrient term, which addresses, let's say, phytate or phytic acid, which can interact like with some of the micronutrients, let's say iron or some or zinc, forming complexes, and accordingly having an impact on the bioavailability, bioaccessibility of such minerals. So if we would like to learn about the impact of anti-nutrients in this context, or consider it quantitatively, we could say, let's also add a term, an anti-nutrient term, which is the relative masses of the anti-nutrient included in a food formulation, divided by maximum tolerated mass of this nutrient, where you can get data out of scientific publications, which we show in our report. And that means we can add such a term for the formulation. It gets a minus, because if we have more anti-nutrients, it would certainly be worse from a nutrition perspective, and a delta anti-nutrient term. If we would reduce this by processing, because now it's a delta, if the process would reduce the anti-nutrient, so it would be beneficial. So if this term gets smaller, so the delta, the overall delta NRF would grow. So that means in this way, we can think about adding terms to the definitions of the quantification of the nutrition value of our target property, and accordingly widen the range of such a NRF, or such a modified NRF, in order to allow for addressing also other processes which have a specific, a desirable impact, in this case, in terms of inactivation, for example, phytate or phytic acid or other anti-nutrients. So I just want to show you what that means. I know this is a little bit complex, because what I do here is in the same diagram, and this is exactly the diagram I showed you before, so this classification matrix diagram. And you see in blue, I did the same like before, NRF 9.3 for the formulation and delta NRF 9.3 for the process. If I'm now extending the NRF, I call it an NRF 9.3.1. The 9 is the desirable nutrients, the 3 is the nutrients to be limited, the 1 is the anti-nutrient, the one anti-nutrient I have taken into account, which is the phytate or the phytic acid, and which is now taken into account in the calculation, in the quantification of the NRF. And the same certainly on the delta NRF scale. And you see, just for a simple comparison, my starting point of the blue arrow, you know, my recipe, without taking the anti-nutrients into account, is at a higher NRF value, so on a higher value on my x-axis. If I take the phytate into account, the anti-nutrients, I'm starting lower. However, my processing, if I'm now during processing inactivating the phytate, so I'm moving up this line, and you see I'm ending up, if I would completely get rid of the phytate, I would end up with a higher coupled criteria, FPFI criteria. The FPFI would be 3.64. And before, having not considered the phytate and accordingly not taken into account the improvement which I can generate by my process, by inactivating the phytate, I would have ended up with an FPFI of 2.36. So this shows that we can implement other terms in describing the nutritional value than so far considered in typical nutrition profiling, and showing at the same time that specific types of processing may have an impact, a positive, would also be negative impacts if we are maybe generating some components which are non-desirable. This would be a term of, let's say, components which we might generate by a process which are as a consequence, let's say, of the processing. Okay, with this we have shown what we call the flexibility of the definition, and let's say the chance for the scientists also to approach a wider frame of definitions of nutrition value and the impact of processing. And this is important because we all know that in a food, matrix effects play an important role. So there is additional criteria which decide about the nutrition value of formulation and the change by processing, because here we only quantify so far at the point of purchase, but going into the digestive, into the metabolic steps, we would certainly like to have parameters considered which also decide about bioaccessibility, bioavailability, and can be quantified in a similar manner as shown here and as already extended by the example of the anti-nutrient. Okay, let me summarize at that point where we are. So we are at the point of purchase here. So for the NOVA frame, as well as for the IOFOS task force frame. And what we did now from a IOFOS task force perspective, we took into account what the formulation before processing was looking like. So we have an NRF2 before, we have an NRF1 after processing. At the point of purchase, the processing has been done. And between these 2 points, we have a delta NRF. There could have been several processing steps. Then you have several deltas between process 1, input, output, process 2, step, input, output, and so forth. So, but we have this clear quantification by delta NRFs. So now formulation and processing are differentiated and impacts quantified by these values. And this means we have now a strong two-dimensional F&P, formulation and processing classification base. This means that we can certainly also use a stronger base for a higher quality, a better quality of correlations with outcomes of the consumption of certain foods with respect to obesity and health risks. So that means we have improved this, but it's still empirical if this correlation is based on observational studies. However, step by step, quantifying into the consumption, digestion, metabolism steps is certainly a way to go in a similar manner as I have described before with respect to widening the frame for considering anti-nutrients. So R&D on causal and functional relationships is certainly necessary, and we have already a lot of puzzle parts about digestive steps and metabolic steps, and I think this is why we can, in principle, use the scheme and ask for what will have been the impact on these steps, on these digestive steps, depending on the formulation you have been choosing and the type of pre-processing you did before, but also taking digestive steps as processing steps into account, because digestion is, in principle, a degradation processing of the composite food which we consume. Okay, we call this scheme, which we suggest to strengthen the base for what NOVA wants to do, classifying at the point of purchase and then building the bridge, the correlation bridge to obesity and health risks. This is our support scheme, which we call IOFOS Formulation and Processing Classification, IF and PC scheme. I do not want to end at that point, and this is why we had the idea to not only take the nutrition value into account, as one of the properties, but also build a scheme which could also be widened to other food properties of relevance. And I mentioned before, when you look at food property characteristics, it's not only the nutrition value, but there is sustainability, there is safety, there is affordability, convenience, palatability. And certainly, if you would normally choose your types of processing, you would certainly aim for like optimizing shelf life. Then you would probably have a trade-off with respect to some vitamins, because if you want to optimize or have the longest possible shelf life, you may choose a thermal sterilization in some respect. You see, my black line shows a certain characteristic spider web pattern of a food. And if I want to treat this food in order to prolong shelf life as the main goal, so I would move along the blue arrow and would result with a blue type of characteristic pattern after processing with thermal sterilization, which is a very strong way to implement in order to prolong shelf life. If I would like to be more gentle and look for the nutrition value to be kept maximally, so then I would maybe use high pressure pasteurization, and then I would reach another profile with optimized nutrition value. So the question is, if we want to build a scheme which is equally relevant, not only for the nutrition value, but also for other parameters to be taken into account in future. And I discussed with many of the nutritionists who were a bit in trouble with a NOVA scheme, because they said, and how do we now embed sustainability or other parameters, sustainability having been mostly in the forefront besides the nutrition value. So I think we did a good job considering that there is other parameters as well. And this is what I just for the final of this presentation want to show you how you can use this, because for the formulation and for the processing, you can certainly also ask, let's assume we did it for the nutrition value now. So we had NRF, X, Y, Z, the Z for the anti-nutrients, we used it already, and the delta NRF for the processing. So if you want to go for address sustainability, you could say my parameter is now the global warming potential. And I could ask, okay, if I have a certain formulation, what would be the global warming potential of my ingredient collection, my formulation? And how would it have changed by processing? I mean, you may say, whenever I process, I consume energy, so I may have worsened it. Yeah, but it depends how I process, how big the delta GVP would be. So I can show what types of processes are contributing more or less to changing to a larger or lesser extent the global warming potential. Let me go for a more complex parameter, which may be interesting going into the digestive steps. I could take, let's say, protein digestibility. Ask for protein digestibility. PDCAS or DIAS are the types of analytics which we can use, and we can say the pure formulation without processing, what would be the digestibility measured by PDCAS of a protein? When we process, we denature maybe to some extent, what is the delta PDCAS accordingly? So we know that some of the proteins being partially denatured can have an improvement in the digestibility. So we would have a delta PDCAS. Again, like for the nutrition value, we can put these values together to let's say a formulation, a processing food index. And now the superscript is not the nutrition value, but the PDCAS. And you can do this with safety aspects, with convenience aspects, and so forth. That means the separation, what is caused by the formulation in that respect, and what is changed by processing, you can handle this in a way as I showed you for the nutrition values. It's a base. Let me summarize. Systematic studies should consider interactions between food components, ingredients, and processes, and quantify NRF and delta NRF values systematically following the introduced IF and PC scheme approach. The IF and PC scheme should be systematically checked because we make a suggestion, we set a starting point, we nucleate, let's say, based on the idea to deconfuse formulation and processing and to quantify and build a better base for correlations or for building relationships with health and obesity risk outcomes. So this scheme should be systematically checked and validated based on various formulation and processing scenarios, and modifications, improvements be implemented. We ask the scientific community on the nutritionist side, on the food engineering side, to check this, to validate this. Complementary studies should look at interactions between additives and processes, and also study eating behavior and matrix effect impacting on nutrient release and digestion kinetics based on this differentiation shown before. A revised definition of formulation and process-induced health risk foods needs to firstly identify the harmfulness of processing treatments and or single specific ingredients. I did not address in detail the ingredients, but it's important that we have a specific look also in the context of codex work done. So the ingredients should also be considered. What would be the ingredients impact in the formulation? How could they change by processing? We could treat them similarly. And not just having a non-quantified mentioning of one ingredient, which makes a food ultra-processed. This is something which cannot easily be handled. An international balanced panel of experts, this is another suggestion from food science, engineering, nutrition, and medicine, should be gathered to draft the future IFNPC/NOVA food classification if we offer NOVA to be refined using the IFNPC. So I think we should really build an expert panel of nutritionists, food scientists, food engineers in order to, let's say, evaluate and evaluate this. Close R&D collaborations. I mean, this is anyhow one of the key issues because we saw a lot of misunderstanding and ambiguities are probably the reason or are probably caused by not very intensive interactions between food scientists and nutritionists and food engineers in the past. We saw the communities like IONS and IOFOS were, let's say, living their more or less separate life. There can be much more interaction, and we have great signs at the horizon. I guess we may discuss about this, that these communities will more jointly work in the future. So IOFOS and IONS are particularly encouraged to initiate such collaborations. We think that FAO Codex Alimentarius should join. There is also, let's say, nucleated this direction to go. UNIDO has already been present prominently at the last IOFOS Congress, so also to build the bridge to certainly the industry who has to produce this type of food. This is equally important. And these collaborations should in future also include the industrial partners, food producers, food processing developers, equipment manufacturers. We kept them out so far because, you know, it's in the NOVA classification saying everything is biased by big food processors, and we wanted to keep this bias out and not be criticized by being, let's say, influenced, let's say, by the producers of the food. But now, having reached a state where there is a, let me call it, neutral platform of IOFOS with IONS, with UNIDO. So I mean, this may be the starting point of inviting also maybe via UNIDO industry for discussion, because finally it has to be a concerted action of all these players in order to improve the food. With this, I would like to thank in particular also my team, Lilia Arni from Denmark, Hongdan Cheng from the US, Jaya Kumar Henry from Singapore, Pin-Soo Kim from Korea, Barbara Schneemann from the US, our former president who supported also very much, like the now Sam Godfrey is doing, and Judith Meach for all the support in assisting the task force in organizing and supporting. And with this, I would also like to thank you for your attention, and I'm certainly ready for questions or discussion parts to come. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Windhub and your team for this amazing presentation and detailed one. And we have time also for questions. So I think Rose Al-Omari have raised her hand. If she would like to ask a question, please start. If not, we have also questions in the chat box. So I would like to start with one of the questions, which is, what is the maximum percentage of the thermal radiation presence after processing food thermally?
If I understood it right, what is the maximum?
What is percentage of thermal radiation present after processing food thermally? This was a question stated in Arabic, so we translated it. So
no problem. No, but if I understand it right, I mean, thermal processing depends on the degree of the thermal processing. I mean, you can start maybe gently and say, okay, I have mild pasteurization up to, let's say, sterilization with at very high temperature, short time, high temperature sterilization. So it depends a bit. If you would like to, let's say, even try reducing spore-forming bacteria, so you may go very high, and as a consequence, you may certainly lose vitamins. I mean, you know, yes, there is already famous diagrams and information available, like how many percentage of, let's say, a thiamine is lost at which time, temperature, combinations. So from a processing perspective, there is already quite some detailed information, quantitative information. So you can tune processing in a way that you lose minimally some of these heat-sensitive vitamins, for example. But if you want to have, let's say, the sterilized, the higher safety, the longer shelf life aspect, you probably live with the trade-off having deteriorated a higher percentage of vitamins like the heat-sensitive thiamine or other vitamins.
True. And we also have like several questions from Mr. Ayad Al-Khatib. One of his questions is, can you please provide more details about NOVA current classification system? Maybe in a short words.
I mean, what I said as the main characteristics is that you divide into 4 classes, yeah? And the 4 classes is the non or minimally processed food, the processed ingredients, the processed food, and the ultra-processed food. And then what I explained at the beginning, we do not get criteria about the degree of processing. We only get criteria what makes, if you have, there's probably one of the clearest publications in 1917, which was done under the name of FAO, but FAO was clearly stating this is not the opinion of FAO, but it was under the roof of FAO, it was published. And it was clearly defining the rules how to identify whether a food is, for example, ultra-processed. And just to give an example, if one of these, let's say, non-household used ingredients, what Carlos Montero uses to name cosmetic ingredients, which industry uses, if only the name is appearing, no quantities, so then it's ultra-processed. So it's very difficult to handle this, I would say. And yeah, how can you divide into processing related classes by criteria which have nothing to do with processing, which are all formulation based? This was exactly the discrepancy which we have faced in our approach.
Yes, thank you. And his second question is, in the countries where another system is used, like Nutri-Score, for example, it would be more feasible to stick to it. If there is a way to implement the classification based on Nutri-Score, and how the classification results would be different. So it's like a comparison between both systems.
I mean, the Nutri-Score, it would be a separate webinar or maybe a series of webinars to explain exactly. But we saw that the Nutri-Score is not that flexible, is not that science-based, you know, like the NRF. But of course, one could try to apply Nutri-Score elements also to the scheme to characterize the formulation and a delta Nutri-Score type of value than for the processing. We just saw that by definition, the Nutri-Score would then not be as flexible for widening the range, as I showed. Okay. My example for the anti-nutrients, this is something which would be difficult to implement in the Nutri-Score compared to the NRF. So we were trying to choose, we were not biased and say the one or the other one, but we are looking for the most flexible one to allow us for this widening the frame.
Okay, and there is, how do you see the implementation of this system? Can we classify food products based on only label information?
On which label information?
Labeling,
label,
yes.
Yeah. I mean, we are, as I mentioned, this has not reached a point to really use it for labeling, but we have to think about it, of course, because finally we want to make it easier for the consumer. Now you could say a 2-parameter system, like for formulation and processing, separate parameters is more complex, and this is only for the nutrition value. We want to go for sustainability, we want to go for palatability, convenience, and so forth, as shown. How can a consumer digest this? I think we should clearly think about what we can offer, because the future will also be dominated by using artificial intelligence, some types of schemes where we may show the consumer in the future a type of QR code where he can go into the different axis direction, where the consumer can go into the nutrition value as the parameter, the sustainability degree. And because this is why I showed we have this flexibility, and I mean, allowing for handling it by the consumer, I do see the future to do this by the use of cognitive algorithms, artificial intelligence, in order to allow the translation into consumer language, which is well understandable. And easily reachable for the consumer, you know. So I mean, this is probably, we make it more complex, yes, but we have to make it more complex to do it properly quantitative, but then bring it into a shape where the consumer can handle it.
Thank you very much. And we have also Professor Samuel. Would you like to add a remark or like a closing remark?
Well, perhaps actually maybe one last question to Eric, you know, trying to take advantage of your participation and your presence, Eric. I mean, you mentioned the possibility of the scalability of the proposed approach with the introduction of the other parameters, convenience, affordability, palatability, sustainability. So do you think actually that these parameters also will be accounted for in a quantitative manner as well, in a similar fashion that you accounted for the formulation and processing, for example?
Absolutely. So I do see that, you know, and this is why the IOFOS community and the IONS community, the worldwide, the global communities, they have such a potential to do research in the different directions that I do see not an infinite time scale to approach this, but it can be done within the next, let's say, decade period to go step by step further. And it would be great if the organizations like IONS, IOFOS, FAO, UNIDO could really foster this, also provide the research projects money to some extent, because this is the key for the scientists or for the institutions to jump on it. So I think, yes, there is a good chance. And the synchronization, which what I was just mentioning to the last question, with implementing already AI algorithm knowledge, you know, it is big data, huh? So, and it's AI is made for big data. So, I mean, we should synchronize this, and it could be very inspiring and very breathtaking steps forward, I think, within a couple of years.
Well,
Thank
thank you, Eric. I don't
And
know about
Okay.
yes, before we close, because we have a raised hand from Asto Nidaya. So would you like to ask your question? Mr.
Hello?
Asio? Yes, Mrs.
Oui,
Asio, sorry. Yes, please.
yes, I'm Asu from Senegal.
Welcome.
I would to participate, but I have some problem to discuss in English. Can I say? Can I tell you
Yes,
in
of
French
course.
and you
Yes, of
translate?
course.
Okay.
Yes, please do.
Voilà. Merci de nous faire participer à ce webinaire. J'ai participé aux 7 webinaires que vous avez donnés. Et je trouve très intéressant pour nous parce qu'au Sénégal, on est en train d'étudier le total diet study pour notre aliment. Donc, voir les contaminants chimiques et les micronutriments préoccupants. Donc, je trouve que vos webinaires sont en étroit intérêt avec ce que nous faisons sur le food safety. Et vraiment, je voulais participer plus amplement. Si dans les prochains webinaires, vous pouvez avoir une traduction de l'anglais en français pour nous permettre de pouvoir discuter et de dire ce qu'on pense vraiment du food safety. Voilà. Et encore merci de nous faire participer à tous ces webinaires-là. C'est vraiment important pour le Sénégal. Merci, M. Godfrey Samuel, et merci à toute l'équipe.
Yeah, merci à vous. Bien sûr, oui, nous sommes prêts de le discuter aussi en français et aussi de focuser sur des points que vous trouvez très importants.
Thanks, Eric. I will attempt actually to do a quick translation for both the intervention and your response into English. Briefly, so our colleague asked you from Senegal. Actually, it was more of a comment and a suggestion than a question. Mostly, indicating the fact that in Senegal, they are embarking right now on a total diet study where they are trying to quantify the occurrence of contaminants and nutrients. She appreciated the fact that these webinars are being made available but also made the recommendation that these webinars be made available with the possibility of interpretation into French, and therefore addressing the needs of the Francophone community, which is a proposal and a suggestion that Eric responded to wholeheartedly with the openness and definitely the outputs of the task force as a start will be used for that purpose. And as to, we will also be devoting some efforts also towards the francophone food science and food regulatory science community in the future. Donc, définitivement, as to, nous allons dédier des ressources pour pouvoir répondre aux besoins de la communauté scientifique, que ce soit en sciences réglementaires des aliments ou en sciences des aliments tout court, en langue française. Donc, nous prenons votre suggestion et votre recommandation très à cœur. Et merci encore pour votre participation et votre contribution.
Thank you very much. And I think we have another raised hand by Dr. Gezubizo Fabian. So, Doctor, if you would like to ask your question. Hello. So may I ask another question until maybe
Hello.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Join us. Yes. Good.
Yes, thank you.
You're
My
welcome.
name is Kabir. I'm from Rwanda. I would
Welcome.
like to thank the team, and I would like to ask Professor Eric Windab or other teams from the committee. How is the committee organized? Can we have like a branch in Africa so that this training would be done like once in a semester, or if someone come from Rwanda, so that we need to increase the food safety in all area, in nutrition, food safety and everywhere. And by now I'm in Asia, in Indonesia. I've seen the way Indonesian has been tried to do their things. So I would like to know if this conference or webinar should be done in a given region of Africa under priorities or authority of the leaders of IOFOS. Thank you.
I mean, from my perspective, the task force would be happy, and we are now in the dissemination phase to spread out as widely and as efficiently as possible. It's a bit in the organizational part in the hands of IOFOS, and this is why I guess Sam can probably give the best answer. There is a planning of several of these webinars, and there is a systematics which Sam may go into some detail.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. And definitely, we wholeheartedly will take your suggestion and recommendation to task. And in fact, as mentioned by Eric, already, in fact, as of January, we will be kicking off already a series of roundtable discussions with an effort of dissemination of the outputs of the task force, and also to trigger the dialogue around these outputs. Certainly, Africa will be as part of the targets and the objectives that we are pursuing with these dissemination efforts. And I'm sharing with you tentatively, but this will be further confirmed with the IOFOS communication team to come. So we are hoping to have an event in collaboration with the the Union of African Universities, with whom IOFOS actually has an agreement during the most likely the third week of January, and the tentative date that is retained right now is the 21st of January. But we will be further communicating on this. So definitely Africa is going to be one of the targets, but also based on your recommendation, we will be developing such dissemination events, and also offer the opportunity of dialogue and discussion with the food science community and the broader science community as a whole, so including the nutrition science community, the clinical community, and the food regulatory community as well, in a geographically targeted approach. And definitely the board of IOFOS is committed to these efforts of dissemination. And as Eric mentioned, with the gracious contribution and support of the members of the task force as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I believe there's another hand raised, but the name is not clear for us. So if can you please ask your question?
Hi, do you
Hi,
hear me?
hello. Yes, we do.
Okay. I think it is me. uh, Firstly, thank you for your moderation, Dr. Ruba.
Thank you
And
very much.
hi, Samuel. I'm Dr. Çelik from Turkey. Hello again after 10 years, by the way, 10 years. Dr. Eric, it was great job, great work. Um, and I was wondering that one thing about your study procedure, it is about while you was working on your study, you got two factors, two um, disciplines, as I said. One is the processing, the other one is the formulation.
Yes.
I'm wondering that whether you consider the natural of the food's microbiological characters. I mean, have you ignored these microbiological things since let me little explain about it. Of course, you already got it, but I would like to explain small things. As you know, some additives, some things when you add the as a processing factor, some microbiological things, microorganisms can affect on about this um, uh, process processing supplement anyway. Uh, just thinking about this negative or positive impact on these additives. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Eric. You're muted. Sorry.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. There is great potential in this direction to also extend the scheme to look a bit more into microbiology aspects from the raw material, from the processing, fermentation processing, but also interaction with the microbiome. So that means, you know, when we start with the criteria characterizing nutrition value based on what nutrition profiling is or nutrient profiling has done so far, it's the starting point. And what I showed with taking some anti-nutrient aspects into account was already a first exemplary step of widening it. Taking microbiological aspects into account, you know, which are, let's say, supporting digestive steps, which are, let's say, shaping the microbiome and generating some interactions. It's a very interesting direction of thoughts. How can you implement this in a similar way in the value of formulation and after processing can be given, you know, in this context.
Thank
So
you.
I can only encourage, I can imagine that this is, let's say, the microbiological impact factor. So depending on how far we know, I mean, there is already quite some knowledge about how you can influence also the shaping of the microbiome, but also the digestibility. It may start already with the gastric, or it may start with the oral processing. When you ferment something, you may get rid of off flavors, which from plant-based material may come in and, you know. So I think it should be seen as an open box and feel encouraged, you know, if your competence is in the field of microbiology, fermentation, and all the way down the digestive and the metabolic steps, what is the influence of the microbiological possibilities to impact? I mean, this is a big avenue. I think I can only encourage to go for.
I think maybe Ruba may have a connection issue because I don't see her moving. So I think she may have been unable to connect. I don't know, Ruba, can you hear us? So yeah, there was definitely a connection issue. So I think with your permission, Eric, I think we've reached probably the end of the time that was allotted to this event, and I will take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of IOFOST, on behalf of all the participants and the global food science and technology community, yourself and all the members of the task force for your contribution to this effort. As you indicated, I believe this is a journey and this is a step in the journey. I think actually we're going to take definitely the next period to share the outputs of the work of the task force and showcasing the importance of this multifactorial approach. Introducing, I guess, less subjectivity, hopefully, to the efforts of classification of foods, and also opening perspectives for the inclusion of other parameters that could contribute to this type of classification and to the various applications that may be resulting from such classification. I take also to heart your point of calling for the multidisciplinary approach to be strengthened for the future of these discussions. Certainly, we have the commitment of the collaboration of the nutrition science community, and this was a joint statement made by the leadership of both IOFOST and IUNS at the last Congress of IOFOST in 2024. And we're looking also forward to including the food industry community, the clinical community, the food regulatory community in the debate, and certainly we'll be leveraging the collaboration that we are strengthening with UNIDO as one of the international organizations heavily involved with the food industry community globally. As I mentioned, we will continue our efforts of dissemination in the upcoming period. And you have our commitment, in fact, to bringing the outputs of the task force closer to you, wherever you are around the world, really taking the notion of the international or the global nature of the food science and technology community and applying that to really solicit your input and your contribution in this work. I'm ready to announce, even though this will be further validated and made available publicly, but ready to announce already 3 events. One dedicated to the ASEAN community, a roundtable on the 14th of January. Another one dedicated to the European community in collaboration with EFOST, and one dedicated to Africa on the 21st of January. So 14th of January for ASEAN, 15th of January in collaboration with EFOST, and the 21st of January in collaboration with the Association of African Universities. I'm using the correct name now, the Association of African Universities, with whom IOFOST has a memorandum of understanding. And further events will be announced subsequently. Ruba, thank you for joining us again. I'm sorry I took over, identifying that you had some issues of connectivity there. So once again, very thankful to you, Eric, and to the members of the task force. And back to you, Ruba, for closing this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking this step from me. And I would like really to thank you, Professor Windhub, for that detailed presentation, and Mr. Judith. Everybody for your interactions. And I would like to also conclude that I'd like to extend sincere thank you to Professor Eric Windhub for his valuable insights and thought-provoking contributions. This has been an incredible informative session, shedding light on the critical distinctions between processed and ultra-processed foods, as well as the outcomes of the IOFOST task force on ultra-processed food. Through this discussion, we've gained a deeper understanding of how ultra-processed foods are impacting global diets and food system, and the importance of evidence-based frameworks to guide policy and consumer choices. It is evident that addressing the challenges posed by ultra-processed foods requires collaboration efforts across science, regulations, and industry. Thank you once again, Professor Windhub, for your expert insights, and to everyone for your participation. And kindly note, the presentation of Professor Winthrop will be available soon on GFORCE website. And ladies and gentlemen, as we bring this year's GFORCE Food Regulatory Science webinar series to a close, I want to take a moment to reflect on what has been a remarkable journey of learning, collaboration, and innovation. Over the past year, 2024, we've tackled diverse range of topics, from threshold-driven risk management practices for allergen in food to halal food certification, methods of analysis, and from exploring potential of camel-derived products to unpacking the complexity of ultra-processed foods. These webinars have truly embodied the spirit of advancing food science and safety quality on a global scale. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all our distinguished speakers who brought unparalleled expertise and perspectives to our discussions. Your contributions have deepened our understanding and inspired action across various fields. Equally, I want to acknowledge the incredible efforts of GFORCE team working tirelessly behind the scenes. Your dedication and hard work are the foundation of this success, ensuring that every webinar is flawlessly executed. And as we part now, I encourage everyone to carry forward knowledge gained towards fostering progress and innovation in our fields. Together, we are equipped to navigate the challenges and opportunities lie ahead. Looking back on this year, I'm filled with gratitude for the brilliant minds and voices that have contributed to the GFORCE webinar. Each session has been a testament to the power of collaboration, shared learning, and special thanks to you, remarkable GFORCE team working tirelessly. And as we look ahead, may peace and health prevail in our countries and across the world. Let us hope for harmony among all nations, resilience in the face of global challenges, and unity in creating a brighter future for generations to come. May the coming year bring wellness, joy, and prosperity to everyone. And ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for the next year's webinar series, where we will continue to explore important and impactful topics together. Until then, I wish you all a joyous holiday seasons and successful start to the new year. Thank you once again, and see you in the new year. Thank you very much. كل عام وأنتم بألف خير.